The wind howled through the canyon, carrying coarse sand that chewed relentlessly at exposed skin. 1,000 yards out, the steel plate was barely a speck in the heat mirage. Grown men with heavy tripods and custom rifles were missing. Then she stepped up to the line. No mat, no bipod, just a battered rifle, 2 boots planted in the dirt, and a single, steady breath. The Nevada high desert does not care about your resume. It doesn't care if you wear a trident, a ranger scroll, or a green beret. At 2 in the afternoon, with the temperature hovering at a blistering 104 degrees and a fishtailing crosswind ripping through the valley. The desert is a great equalizer. It makes liars out of good shooters and fools out of arrogant ones. Today it was heavily favoring the fools. Burke cursed, his voice a low, gravelly rasp over the crackle of the Peltor headset. He ripped the bolt of his massive .338 Lapua Magnum back, sending a piece of smoking brass tumbling into the red dirt. He didn't bother looking through the spotting scope. He already knew. "Miss left edge," Trent said. Trent was on the glass, sweating through his combat shirt, his eye pressed tightly against the Leupold spotter. Wind caught it, dropped an inch, drifted 3. Burke let out a breath that sounded like a tire deflating. He rolled off his shooting mat, brushing the dust from his chest. "This wind is garbage. It's swirling in the canyon. You can't read it. It's blowing 10 off the muzzle, 15 downrange, and practically dead at the target." A handful of other operators stood under the meager shade of a corrugated tin roof behind the firing line. They were a mixed bag of Tier 1 guys, brought together for a joint force sniper validation. Hard men, cynical men. Men who had spent the last decade in the worst corners of the world, relying on heavy, stable equipment to do a very specific, violent job. They nodded in silent agreement with Burke. The conditions were bordering on unshootable. At 1,000 yards, 30,000 inches, even a millimeter of error at the muzzle meant completely missing the 30-inch steel torso downrange, and they were shooting prone, belly in the dirt, rifles resting on heavy adjustable bipods, rear stocks squeezed tight into sand socks for maximum immovable stability. Then came the sound of Velcro tearing, followed by the metallic click of a magazine seating into a magwell. Jess racked the bolt of her rifle. The sound was sharp, mechanical, and entirely out of place among the heavy artillery on the line. Burke wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of a filthy glove and turned. His eyes dropped to the weapon in her hands, then dragged up to her face. He didn't hide his smirk. "You're up, Barnes?" Burke asked. He didn't sound malicious, just deeply, fundamentally dismissive. It was the tone of a man watching someone try to empty the ocean with a slotted spoon. Jess didn't look at him. She adjusted the padded strap of her sling. "I'm up." She was 5'7", carrying a frame built on dense, hard-earned muscle. But next to the towering bulk of guys like Burke, she looked a weight class down. But it wasn't her size that drew the stares of the men under the tin roof. It was her weapon. While the rest of the line was running heavy bolt-action chassis rifles, guns that weighed 20 pounds and fired massive, wind-bucking cartridges, Jess was holding a beat-up, short-barreled .308. It was a gas-operated gun, notoriously less precise than a bolt action. The paint on the handguard was chipped, revealing the black anodized aluminum beneath. Worse, the rail was naked. There was no bipod attached to the front. "Where's your gear, Barnes?" Trent asked, leaning back from his spotting scope. "You leave your Harris in the truck?" "Didn't bring one," Jess said flatly. Burke let out a short, bark-like laugh. "You're going to shoot an AR-10 at $1,000, with a 20-inch barrel, shooting standard 175 grain. He shook his head, looking back at the men in the shade. A few of them chuckled. "Physics is a thing, Barnes. That round is going to be dropping like a stone by the time it hits 900. The wind is going to play ping-pong with it. Jess walked past him toward the firing line. I know the ballistics. Then you know it's a wasted trigger pull, Burke pressed, stepping closer. The cynical edge in his voice sharpened. The unspoken tension of the last 3 weeks of training was bubbling up. The scrutiny of having a female SEAL in the integration program was a constant, low-frequency hum in the background of every evolution. Some guys ignored it. Some guys hated it. Burke just thought it was a political stunt that got in the way of lethal efficiency. We are missing with .338s in the prone. You think you're going to lob a .308 in there? Look, just borrow my rig. Get your qual, check the box, and let's get out of this oven. I shoot my own gun, Burke. She stepped up to the line. But instead of dropping down into the dirt, instead of kicking her legs out to form a stable shooting base on the ground, Jess stopped. She stood bladed to the target, her feet shoulder-width apart. She raised the rifle. The low murmur of conversation under the tin roof instantly died. The silence was heavier than the heat. What are you doing? Burke asked, the amusement draining from his face, replaced by genuine bewilderment. Shooting, Jess said. Standing, Trent blurted out. Standing, Burke stared at her, then looked out at the target, a speck of grey against a sea of brown 1,000 yards away. You're out of your mind. Nobody shoots a grand standing. Not in this wind. Not with that toy. Instructor Henderson, Jess called out, ignoring Burke entirely. Her voice was calm, lacking any of the forced bravado the men usually projected. It was purely transactional. Henderson, a grizzled master chief who had been quietly taking notes on a clipboard in the back, stepped forward. He chewed on a toothpick, his eyes narrowed behind dark, polarized Oakley frames. He looked at Jess's stance. He looked at her bare rifle. He looked at the wind flags whipping violently downrange. You calling a shot, Barnes? Henderson asked, his voice low and gravelly. Yes, Master Chief. Position? Standing unsupported, Henderson didn't smile. He didn't mock her. He just raised his own spotting scope. Target is the 1,000-yard steel. Shooter is ready. Spotter ready. Wind is... whatever the hell it wants to be. Send it when you have it. There is a biological reality to holding a 10-pound piece of metal and glass to your shoulder. The human body is a terrible shooting platform. It is a mass of twitching muscles, pulsing blood, and shifting lungs. When you lie on the ground, you bypass the body, letting the earth hold the weapon. When you stand, you are fighting your own anatomy. At 100 yards, a slight heartbeat thump translates to a wobble of a fraction of an inch. At 1,000 yards, a heartbeat will throw your crosshairs off the target by several feet. Jess shut out Burke's heavy breathing to her left. She shut out the heat radiating off the gravel through the soles of her boots. Show them nothing, she thought. Just the work. She aggressively looped her left arm through the heavy nylon sling, pulling it high above her bicep. She snapped her arm down, locking the sling tight across the back of her triceps and chest. It dug brutally into her skin, cutting off the circulation. That was the point. The hasty sling was a relic, an old Marine Corps trick mostly forgotten in the era of high-tech tripods and barricade stops. But right now, it turned her arm, her chest, and the rifle into a single, tension-locked triangle of bone and nylon. She tucked her left elbow tight against her ribs. Bones support. Muscles fatigue and shake. Bones do not. She looked through the optic. The image was a swimming, chaotic mess. The heat mirage rising off the desert floor made the steel target look like it was underwater, warping and dancing. Read the water, she told herself. She wasn't looking at the target. She was looking at the air between her and the target. She watched the mirage. It was flowing right to left, moving fast, then abruptly boiling straight up at the 600-yard mark before snapping hard left again near the target. Burke's voice bled through her electronic ear protection. "She's going to pull it right into the dirt. Look at the wobble." He was right. Her reticle was tracing a figure 8 over the target. It is impossible to hold a rifle perfectly still while standing. The trick is not to fight the wobble. The trick is to accept it, pattern it, and time the break of the trigger, exactly as the crosshairs intersect the center of the steel. Jess took a deep breath. The dry air burned her throat. She let half of it out. She tightened her right hand on the pistol grip, pulling the rifle hard into the pocket of her shoulder. Her trigger finger rested straight against the frame. Heartbeat. She felt the thud in her chest. The crosshairs jumped up and left. Heartbeat. Thud. The crosshairs jumped again. She was calculating the drop in her head. A 175 grain, .308 bullet, leaving an 18-inch barrel at 2,550 feet per second. At 1,000 yards, she needed almost 40 minutes of angle for elevation. She had already dialed her turret to the max, and she still had to hold the crosshairs high, aiming entirely off the target, into the empty air above it. The wind. She needed 3.5 mils of left hold. She was aiming at nothing. A patch of empty, shimmering air high and left, of a piece of metal she could barely see. The silence behind her was absolute. The men weren't laughing anymore. They were watching a train wreck unfold. They were waiting for the inevitable crack, the puff of dust 100 yards short, and the quiet walk of shame back to the benches. Jess closed her eyes for a microsecond. She reset her focus. Inhale, exhale. The crosshairs drifted down, riding the natural respiratory pause. They drifted left. The wind flags on the range suddenly dropped. The violent whipping stopped. The mirage slowed its lateral movement and began to boil upward. A lull. A tiny 3-second window where the canyon held its breath. Jess's finger slid from the frame down to the curved shoe of the trigger. She didn't yank it. She applied steady, relentless pressure, increasing the weight seamlessly as the center of her figure 8 wobble drifted across her aiming point in the empty sky. Heartbeat. Break. The rifle roared, bucking hard against her shoulder. A jet of hot gas and unburnt powder slammed the dust on the ground into a chaotic cloud. The recoil drove her back a fraction of an inch, but her boots stayed rooted. She immediately followed through, driving her eye back into the scope, fighting the recoil to find the target. "Shot," Trent muttered automatically, his eye still glued to his spotter. Now came the wait. A bullet traveling 1,000 yards takes time, nearly a full second and a half. In the world of gunfights, a second and a half is an eternity. It is enough time to doubt yourself, enough time to regret pulling the trigger. Under the tin roof, nobody breathed. Burke stood perfectly still, his jaw clenched, staring down range. 1,001, 1,002. Jess kept her eye in the glass, watching the empty air above the target. Through the spotting scope, Trent saw the trace, the visible distortion of air violently displaced by the supersonic bullet, creating a tiny, arcing vapor trail. The trail peaked high, fighting gravity, then began its steep, rapid descent toward the desert floor. "Tracking," Trent whispered. The vapor trail fell through the scope's field of view, plummeting down toward the steel silhouette. Far down the canyon, a tiny grey puff of lead spatter exploded off the exact center of the steel plate. A full second later, the sound traveled back to the firing line. Tink. It was a sharp, clear, unmistakable ring of copper, and lead shattering against hardened AR-500 steel. It was the sweetest sound in the infantry world. Jess didn't smile. She didn't pump her fist. She slowly lowered the rifle, resting the buttstock against her hip. She reached up with her right hand, pressed the magazine release, and caught the empty mag as it dropped. She pulled the bolt back, visually clearing the chamber, and let the rifle hang from its sling. She finally turned around. The men under the tin roof were statues. Trent was still hunched over his spotting scope, his mouth slightly open. He blinked, looking up from the glass, then back down into it, as if the steel plate might have magically changed its mind. Burke looked like he had been struck with a bat. The cynical, dismissive sneer was completely gone, replaced by a blank, hollow stare. He looked at the 1,000-yard target, then looked at the bare, scratched-up .308 hanging from Jess's chest. "Center mass," Master Chief Henderson said quietly, his eye still behind his glass. He clicked his pen, wrote something on his clipboard, and lowered his scope. He looked at Burke. "I believe you owe the lady an apology, Burke, and perhaps a lesson in basic marksmanship." Burke swallowed hard. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his dry throat. He looked at Jess, the reality of what he had just witnessed, rewriting his entire understanding of the physics of shooting. Jess didn't wait for his apology. She didn't need it. She reached into her cargo pocket, pulled out a fresh magazine, and tapped it against her helmet. "Master Chief," Jess said, her voice cutting through the heavy, stunned silence. "Permission to move to the 1,500-yard line?" The walk to the 1,500-yard firing line was a quiet, dusty procession. The sun had shifted, baking the back of their necks, turning the Nevada air into a suffocating convection oven blast. Nobody spoke. The gravel crunched under heavy combat boots. Jess walked near the front, her rifle slung across her chest, a canvas assault pack dangling from her left hand. She wasn't smiling. The 1,000-yard standing shot was a point proven, a sudden, violent punctuation mark on a conversation she was tired of having. But 1,500 yards was a different language entirely. Burke fell in step beside her. He didn't look at her, keeping his eyes locked on the distant ridge where the new steel targets were barely visible against the scrub brush. "You know what that round does past 1100, Burke said. His voice had lost the sneer. It was low, clinical, professional. "It goes subsonic," Jess replied, her breathing steady as they hiked up a slight incline. "Hits the transonic barrier. The shockwave catches up to the bullet. Turbulence knocks it off its axis, and it starts to tumble. It turns into a knuckleball," Burke agreed. "You can't predict a knuckleball, Barnes, not with a standard 175 grain. Even if you dial your optic to the mechanical limit, you don't have enough elevation in that scope to aim at the target. You'll be holding in the clouds." "I know. So why push it?" Burke finally turned his head, his brow furrowed beneath his sweat-stained cap. "You made your point. You embarrassed me. You shut the line down. You take this shot with that gun, and you miss by 10 feet. All you do is prove that the platform has limits." Jess stopped. She turned to face him. Her eyes were hard, tired, but completely clear. "You think I took that standing shot to embarrass you?" Jess asked. Burke didn't answer. "I took it because in a kinetic environment, in the mountains, in a stairwell, or hanging out the side of a little bird. I don't always have time to lay out a foam mat and dial my bipod," Jess said, her voice dropping a register. "I use the platform I have. I know exactly what this gun can do, and I know exactly what it can't. I'm not pushing the gun, Burke. I'm pushing me." She turned and closed the last 50 yards to the firing line. Master Chief Henderson was already there, driving a wooden stake into the dirt to mount his spotting scope. He looked up as the team arrived. The men gathered around, no longer seeking the shade. They stood in the blistering sun, a semicircle of quiet, focused operators. The circus atmosphere was gone. This was work. Jess didn't stand this time. She dropped her canvas assault pack onto the dirt, kicking it a few times to settle the gear inside, creating a V-shaped cradle. She dropped to her knees, then slid into the prone position, driving the magazine well of her AR-10 hard against the back of the pack. She dug her boot toes into the hard-packed earth, loading forward pressure into the rifle, locking it into her shoulder pocket. It wasn't a pristine bench rest setup. It was an improvised, hasty infantry prone. Trent knelt beside her, pulling his spotter from his bag. He didn't ask if she wanted a spot. He just set it up. "I'm on your glass, Barnes," Trent said quietly. "Target is the left side square. Painted white, 36 by 36 inches. Jess buried her eye in the optic. The target was a postage stamp lost in a sea of boiling mirage. At 1,500 yards, her reticle covered the entire steel plate. "Dialing," Jess muttered. She reached up to the top turret of her optic. She turned it counterclockwise. Click, click, click. She spun it until it physically bottomed out. She had dialed in every ounce of elevation the scope possessed, and it still wasn't enough. "Scope is maxed," Jess said. "I need another 6 mils of elevation, holding over." In the scope, she lifted the crosshairs entirely off the target, floating the central aiming point into the empty, shimmering sky high above the ridge. She was aiming blindly into the air, using the lower hash marks on her reticle to guess the hold. "Wind?" Jess asked. Trent stared through his scope for a long 10 seconds. "It's a mess. Canyon is acting like a funnel. You've got a 5-mile-an-hour headwind at the muzzle, a 10-mile full-value crosswind blowing right to left at the 800 mark, and a dead spot at the target. Hold right, call it 4 mils. 4 mils, right? 6 mils high." She was essentially using the rifle like a mortar. Behind her, Burke unslung his massive .338 Lapua. He didn't set up to shoot. He popped the bipod legs, lay down in the dirt 3 feet to Jess's right, and looked through his own high-powered scope to watch her target. "Send it when you're ready." Henderson's voice drifted over the line. Jess controlled her breathing. At this distance, the Earth's rotation physically factored into the bullet's flight path. The Coriolis effect. The spin drift of the bullet alone would drag it inches to the right. The tumbling effect of the transonic zone could throw it feet in any direction. She was asking a piece of lead, the weight of 2 pennies, to travel almost a mile, survive breaking the sound barrier backwards, navigate 3 different wind zones, and hit a square of metal. Accept the wobble. Accept the environment. She didn't fight the rifle. She let her skeleton absorb the weight. She timed her pulse. Inhale. Exhale. Pause. Her finger rolled straight back on the trigger. Crack. The rifle bucked. The muzzle brake violently redirected the expanding gases, kicking up a massive horizontal cloud of red dust. Jess stayed buried in the scope, fighting the recoil, keeping her eye open to spot her own trace. "Shot!" Trent called out. The silence that followed was agonizing. A bullet traveling 1,500 yards takes nearly 3 full seconds to arrive. 3 seconds is enough time to rethink your entire life. It is an excruciating void of sound and feedback. 1001, 1002, 1003. Nothing. No puff of dirt, no sound. "Impact dirt," Trent finally said, his voice flat. "Short and left. You dropped out of the sky about 200 yards early. The wind caught it hard when it destabilized." A few guys shifted their weight. Nobody laughed. Nobody cracked a joke about her gear. They had all missed at this distance with better equipment. Jess didn't move her head. She rapidly cycled the bolt. "Correction. Bring it up 2 mils. Hold right another 2. "You're fighting the tumble now, Barnes. It's skipping off the air," Trent said. Jess adjusted her hold in the empty sky. Inhale, exhale, crack. 1001, 1002, 1003. "Dirt," Trent said again. "Just off the right edge. Elevation was good. You barely missed the plate. The bullet is walking." Jess cycled the bolt, 1 round left in the magazine. She paused. She looked at the mirage again. It was boiling violently, but the right-to-left flow had slightly weakened. The canyon was taking a breath. Holding left edge of the previous call, Jess whispered. She settled her breathing. She blocked out the heat. the sweat stinging her eyes, the crushing pressure of the men watching her every twitch. She became the V-cradle of the pack. She became the stock. Break, crack. The rifle hammered her shoulder. She drove her eye back into the glass. In his scope, Burke watched the tiny, faint vapor trail arc into the stratosphere. It peaked, hung in the air for a fraction of a second, and began its terrifyingly steep dive. As it dropped past the 1,000-yard mark, the trace started to wobble. A visible corkscrew pattern in the air as the bullet fought physics, bleeding speed, tumbling into the subsonic void. It plummeted toward the white square. 1001, 1002, 1003. Through his optic, Burke saw a microscopic grey smudge appear on the very top right corner of the white steel plate. A heavy, suffocating silence hung over the firing line. 2.5 seconds later, the canyon echoed. Tink. It was faint. It was hollow. It lacked the heavy, commanding smack of a Magnum cartridge. But it was undeniably steel. Trent slowly sat back on his heels. He wiped his mouth. Impact. Top right corner. Barely caught the edge. But it's steel. Jess exhaled a long, shaky breath. She pressed the magazine release, caught the empty mag, locked the bolt to the rear, and pushed the safety selector to safe. She rolled off the pack and sat up in the dirt. For a long moment, nobody said a word. The wind picked up again, howling over the tin roof of the distant 100-yard line, blowing sand across their boots. Burke didn't stand up. He stayed in the prone, looking through his scope at the faint grey mark on the distant white square. Slowly, he reached up and closed the flip cap on his objective lens. He gathered his rifle and stood. He walked over to Jess, towering over her as she sat in the dust. He looked down. That bullet had no business hitting that plate, Burke said. His voice was gravelly, stripped of all its former arrogance. No, Jess agreed quietly. It didn't. Burke extended a thick, calloused hand. Jess looked at it for a second, then reached up, gripping his forearm. Burke hauled her to her feet with one effortless pull. "Good wind call, Barnes," Burke said, looking her in the eye. In the Tier 1 community, there were no ticker-tape parades. There were no grand, tearful apologies. Acknowledging a shooter's read on the environment was the highest, most absolute form of respect a sniper could offer. "Thanks," Jess said, brushing the red dirt off her uniform. Master Chief Henderson clicked his pen. He made a single check mark on his clipboard. He looked at the group of silent, hardened men standing in the brutal Nevada sun. "All right, ladies," Henderson barked, turning his back on the targets. "Show's over. Pack up the glass. We're moving to high-angle barricades. And Burke." "Yeah, Master Chief." "You're shooting the AR-10. Burke groaned, slinging his heavy magnum over his shoulder. Jess gave him a faint, razor-thin smile, picked up her beat-up rifle, and started walking toward the trucks. The desert didn't care about resumes, but it always respected the work. Hitting a 1,500-yard target with a tumbling .308 isn't just skill, it's a masterclass in reading the impossible. Jess didn't just beat the elements. She shattered the ego of an entire firing line without saying a word. In a world where respect is earned entirely in the dirt, she proved that the shooter matters far more than the gear. If this story kept your heart racing, hit that like button, share it, and subscribe for more.